banshee do?
Christmas is death. Scream.
Yes. But I'm not going to tell you a story about the banshee. I'm going to tell you a story about a fairy woman you may not have heard of before called a Lananshee. And who's the Lananshee? The Lananshee is a beautiful fairy who preys on handsome young men. Like yourself, dear.
I said unsafe.
And the thing is that if you suspect she's a Lananshee, mustn't look her in the eye, because that's when she gets power over you. So my story begins on an evening when Randall MacDonald was sitting in his home. He was a young, handsome, fit young man. But he'd fallen on hard times. There were holes in the roof of his house. The fox had got his chickens. The door was practically falling off its hinges. He had a few pennies in a jar. And he thought to himself, what am I going to do with those few pennies? And he thought, I'm going to go down to the pub and drink the edges off my sorrow. And so he went. Down to the pub, he met some friends. He used those few pennies to have a drink. And when the money was gone, he made his way back to his farmhouse. And as he was walking to the farmhouse, the road kind of curved to the right. On the left-hand side, he saw a woman by a tree digging. In the middle of the night with the moon high up in the sky. It was a very strange thing. And as the woman heard him approaching, she turned around. At that moment, Randall MacDonald, he pulled up the collar of his coat. She said, good evening. He said, good evening. And he carried on walking because he suspected that he knew who she was. And as he was walking and walking and walking, suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. So he walked a bit faster, and the footsteps got faster. And he began to run, and the footsteps got faster and faster and faster, until he was running and running and running up to the farmhouse, and then he ran inside and he shut the door behind him. And he went inside, and he could hear outside a howling and a screeching and a crying and a shouting. It was the Lananshee. And she had seen Randall. She had seen him, and she wanted him. And it went on all night long, a screeching and a howling and a screaming. And he didn't get a wink of sleep. And he woke up in the morning. And he went over the events of the night before. He'd gone to the pub, he drank something, he walked, and there was that woman who was digging, the Lananshee, who followed him. And you know what they say, if you see a fairy digging, what they're doing is they're probably burying some fairy gold. And so, Randall, he got a spade, and he went down to that tree that he'd seen, and he began to dig. And very soon, he heard the sound of metal upon metal. And then he knelt on his knees, and he started to push the dirt aside. And no sooner had he pulled a great big chest out of the ground. And he opened it, and there inside, it was full of gold. He shut it, he dragged it up the path, and he shoved it underneath his bed. And the day went by, and it became evening time, and as soon as the sun had set, there came the Lananshee. And there was a howling and a screeching. Just like that. And he didn't get a single wink of sleep. He woke up in the morning, and this is how it was every single day. He woke up, he went about his business, he went to bed, and as soon as he went to bed, there was a screeching and a howling, because now not only did she want Randall, she wanted her fairy gold back. got thinking. What was he to do? What was he to do? Every night, the Lananshee came back. Every night she was screeching. He needed to do something. He decided what he needed to do was he needed to get himself a wife. If the Lananshee knew that he was married, she would leave him alone. And he thought to himself, he thought about the lovely Nancy who lived in the village. Now, I'm going to ask you just for a moment to give me a little bit, because I need to get back into the story. It's really quite hard. So I'm just going to ask you for a bit of silence. So, he needed to marry Nancy. But Nancy's dad, he knew that if he'd asked Nancy's dad for Nancy's hand in marriage, that he would just say, like, what am I going to do? Leave my lovely Nancy to marry you? You've got holes in your roof, you've got chickens that have been stolen, the hinges of your door have already fallen off. So he decided first he was going to take that gold, fix the roof, fix the chickens, fix the hinges on the door. And when those things were done, he went down to the village and he asked for Nancy's hand in marriage. Nancy's father looked at the fine house, he looked at the fine chickens, he looked at the door on the hinges. He said, okay, you can marry her. And so Nancy and Randall MacDonald, they were married. And Nancy, she agreed. She'd already checked out Randall and she liked him very much. And there was a great wedding. And there was dancing, and there was singing, and there was music, and there was storytelling all night long. And there were many, many gifts. They came home and they unpacked them. And one of the gifts was a beautiful mirror. And that mirror sat above the mantelpiece. And from that day on, Randall went to bed and it was quiet. There was no sound, there was no screeching, there was no hollering. And they lived a very fine life together. And they would sit together in the evening, look at each other and realise that it was so much better to be one rather than two. To be one together rather than two separate. And their life was good. Every day it was a pleasure to go out to work together, to be together in the evening. And then one winter, Nancy said, I'm going to go and I need to be with my father. He's very unwell. And they had not spent a day apart. And so Nancy, she said goodbye to Randall and closed the door. And Randall, he sat down and he sat by the fire. And he thought about how lovely it had been, their life together. And the sun began to set and there was a knock at the door. Gung, 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 gung. And Randall thought, it's Nancy, maybe she's come home earlier. And he went to the door, he opened the door and he looked into the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen. But they were not the eyes of Nancy. And I don't know what happened then. All I know is that when Nancy came back a few days later, the door was wide open and there were footsteps away from the house. And I don't know how much time passed. All I know is that one day, Randall woke up. He was lying in a ditch. And he got himself up and he started to walk to his house. And he walked, and he walked, and he got to the front door. But it all looked a bit different. So he went to the side of the house and he looked through the window. And he looked inside and he saw a little baby in a crib. And he wondered how long he'd been away. And he went to the front door and he knocked on the front door. Gung, gung, gung. And Nancy opened. And she looked at him and said, how can I help you? And Randall said, Nancy, what do you mean? It's me, your husband. And she looked at him and she said, my husband is out in the field. And if you're talking about Randall MacDonald, my first husband, well, if he came back today after leaving without a trace 7 years ago, he would still be a young man So why do you mock me, old man, she said. And with those words, he ran past her into the house and to that mirror above the mantelpiece. And he looked, and what he saw there was an old, old man with a long grey beard. And he turned round and he brushed past Nancy and he walked into the woods and he was never seen